Welcome to the 39th episode of the Decentralized Opportunity Podcast. I'm your host, Tanner Lytle, here with your other host,
Wyatt Carson. What are we talking about today, Tanner?
So we're scouring around Twitter. We came up with a post that talked about this new version of South Park that was completely generated by AI. And I thought this was very timely, especially that everything kind of going on with the Hollywood strikes right now with the Screen Actors Guild and the Writers Guild, and how one of their big concerns is AI generated content, whether it be scripts and stuff the studios are using to generate scripts, or it's digital versions of actors being used to be generated for a lot of these movies. And right in the heat of all this battle, well, sure enough, here comes this white paper use case of South Park episodes. So what was your initial impression, Wyatt, when you first saw it?
We were just chatting before we really hit record, and my first initial reaction was, this is cool. It's kind of like playing a giant Sims game, right? But like with AI. Could you imagine Sims if they could talk back and create dialogue that's AI generated? The concept's really cool, really interesting. Then I started reading about it and digging into it, and you're spot on, right on the heels of the actors and writers strike going on in Hollywood right now. I started thinking, it's like, oh, that's why they're striking, because the implications are crazy for what it can do.
So to read the tweet, we'll put it up on the screen here, but it's from The Simulation, which is at Fable Simulation, announcing our paper on generative TV and showrunner agents. Create an episode of TV shows with a prompt. Show one will write, animate, direct, voice, and edit for you. They say that we use South Park for research only, and they won't be releasing the ability to make your own South Park episodes since it's not their IP. But with it, they went through their research paper, and they show mini episodes of the South Park episodes, which are really cool. So there's a lot of limitations that they're currently are facing with a lot of these generative models, particularly when it comes to like consistency, when it comes to how entertaining a lot of this stuff is. And so they've went really in depth in trying to solve a lot of these problems, where they are trying to build pretty close, what I would say is actually, I don't know, 80% there of an episode. I mean, it's not nearly as good as a traditional South Park, but it really is a first glimpse of what's coming down the pipe, right?
Yeah, it is. And when you read about how they made it, they just fed something like 30 hours of South Park, which anyone who's familiar with the South Park series knows there's more than 30 hours. And they're on like season 30 or something crazy like that. They just fed it content. And then basically what they do is they set up the characters, creates characters, and puts them into the style of South Park. And then the second task that it does is it generates the background, the environment that they exist in, and it just created it. Same South Park's, animation style, art style. And then, of course, you can talk about script and dialogue and all that. Same thing. South Park is a really probably a great use case for them. It's animated, so you don't have to deal with real life people. AI is not to that point yet, sort of. They're working on it. But to make an animated thing that just kind of takes concepts and puts them together for you, and you can create an entire episode of a show based off of existing material, it's fascinating. It's wonderful. If you read through their tweets and their website, especially regarding South Park, every like paragraph ends with, not our intellectual property. We will not be doing this. I still think they're very brave in utilizing South Park as their scenario, but the proof of concept is amazing. Like I said, if I could build my own South Park universe and fill it with characters that I'm myself, my family, my friends that just live in South Park and do South Park related things, that sounds amazing. But once again, we're now dealing with the downfall of AI generated content and the impact it has on the industries, on the individuals who work it. And of course, profits, man. If you can build something off of this platform almost automatically sell it for content, consumption, create ad revenue, do all this for almost no effort. You're not paying actors, you're not paying voice actors, human actors, anything like that. The income potential is phenomenal. But as anyone who's listened to our show has heard us over the last half a year or so, we ebb and flow on where we're at with AI. Both of us. I use AI every single day. I live in Midjourney now, and I use ChatGPT for my life, it seems like. But I'm starting to get the humanist view on all of it, and it's really kind of distorted my thinking.
It's really a first taste of what entertainment's going to look like. And on their abstract of their paper, they give a quote saying, maybe people are still just upset about the last seasons of Game of Thrones. Imagine you can make AI make a new ending to go a different way, or maybe even put yourself in as the main character or something. So you have the ability now, or what we're moving into is, rather than shows being the same for everybody, they could be potentially custom for every single person and dynamically generated. And what's really unique about, I guess, the tweet storm that they kind of put it out is there's a ton of different episodes that they put on different subjects, because basically they have this simulation that they put, and we'll kind of dig into a little bit of how the unique things about the simulation. But they put a prompt, put some characters they want with it, and it dynamically generates this episode. They, through some of the reviews and news articles that were coming up, they started incorporating those into future episodes. So based off the buzz that it's generating in the news, they're able to dynamically generate additional episodes. So you can really see how content's going to be changing, where not only will the material just live and start, it'll kind of evolve and go depending on who's listening to it, who's talking about it, what things are going up in the news. Everything could be very up to date and changing. And it's going to, again, completely change how entertainment's created.
100%. And I know you're probably very familiar with it, Tanner, that animation entertainment, for example, has done nothing but grow for decades. It's huge. If you're an anime fan, the world is abundant. I personally don't know much about anime, but I do watch South Park. So when you think about not live action, because that's a whole other set of obstacles, but just in animation content, and we're talking video games, YouTube content, freemium content, and then of course straight up, maybe a Hulu animated cartoon will show up some days, the base purely off AI. The concept is awesome, and I'm really excited about what this could do for future video game systems. I'm not a huge video game player either. I mean, I used to be. I just don't have time anymore to sit down forever and play video games, unfortunately. But for example, I was trying to take this simulation, this Fable simulation, and think about what it would be like to play a video game with something like that. And kind of lame admission here, my wife and I, when we have the chance and we find the time, we both enjoy playing Stardew Valley. I'm sure you're familiar with it. A lot of people have heard about it. It's a very laid back farming simulator type game. That's it. It's very similar to what's the Switch one where you're also on an island and you're became super popular during the pandemic, where everyone had their own island and you were
Animal Crossing.
It's like Animal Crossing, just way more farming related. But anyway, so I was thinking about it. I was like, man, if Stardew Valley came out where the NPCs were AI generated and were able to have dynamic conversations with me, how amazing would that game be? The possibilities are limitless. You could play that game for the rest of your life and never replay the same scenario or have the same conversation with a generated character. And that's amazing to me.
So NVIDIA actually did a tech demo on, it was a game kind of looked like Cyberpunk 2077.
Mm-hmm.
You went into a ramen restaurant and they were talking about how this gang was causing them trouble in the neighborhood and that you had to go talk to a specific person, and everything was generated based off of the activities of the world. So we're already starting to see that, and there's just some issues with latency. And that's one of the things they talked about in this specific paper, where it takes a certain amount of time to generate each type of scene in the episode, because they actually have to generate the backgrounds, the characters, write the script, do the voiceover part of it. And compared to actually creating an episode, it takes no time, but it still takes a minute or something like that. And so that's currently one of the barriers that you have with some of these content creation. The other thing that's really cool, like you were saying, compared to a video game, is their goal with doing this kind of stuff is kind of like a version of artificial general intelligence, where they build these actual like living AI things into existence. So it's not just some chatbot, but some virtual being in this virtual world that are living their lives. And there was a white paper in Stanford where they kind of made this version of The Sims, and they just kind of let it exist. And they were throwing characters' birthday parties, and they were referencing all sorts of events that happened completely independent of what they prompted and scripted these characters to do. And so this version is like, well, what if you could create a world like a South Park world? Let these characters actually live their virtual lives, and then prompt different story scenarios. And so it'll be a lot more relatable and real. And so one of the concepts that they talk about AI has right now with some of the limitations of large language models is the slot machine effect. So sometimes you pull and it's really inconsistent. And you can see that. And then they also refer to something called like the oatmeal effect, where if you keep like regenerating it, everything is just kind of mushy and not really that great. It'll give you variations, but it's like 1,000 variations of oatmeal rather than being some like actual good thing you want to consume. And so by simulating a lot of these things, they're actually living kind of virtual worlds, and you can almost be a voyeur in it.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
So I think you said a very important word there, which is voyeur. And I wanted to discuss the moral implications of a system like this, of a new way of forming content that's AI generated. Many people, millions and millions of people around the world, recently watched season 6 of Black Mirror. The newest season. I am a giant Black Mirror fan. I've been watching it since it came out. I love it. It's all just moral warning stories about technology, typically. And the very first episode of the most recent season was probably one of the more successful episodes. It was called Jonah's Awful, and it stars Annie Murphy from Schitt's Creek. And I'm sure many people have seen this and familiar with it, but the concept of it is she works for what is essentially a goof of Netflix in the episode. And she's like a director. She's pretty, moderately high up in the company. And one day she goes home and turns on whatever their version of Netflix is again. And there's a show called Jonah's Awful, which are with her face on it. And she looks very confused. She clicks on the episode, and it's basically an actor playing her, doing exactly what she did during that day and showing just the worst parts of her day. Maybe you spilled food on your shirt, or you broke up with an ex, or whatever that episode showed. It shows everything. And she's starting to wonder, why is this Netflix show, or whatever they called it, essentially duplicating my life for other people's entertainment. She goes into work the next day, and everyone's seen Jonah's Awful, and everyone knows it's her. They know it's about her. They use her name. They use her position and everything she does. But now they get to see the really kind of personal aspects of her life she doesn't want people to know at work. And it just spirals from there. The episode's crazy and fun. I strongly recommend, if you don't watch Black Mirror, to start there. But that's how I equated this in regards to TV or streaming content. In video games, cool. I think that's awesome. I don't think anyone goes into a video game with the assumption that they're going to be offended or anything like that usually. But with streaming content, you start getting into not intellectual property per se, but just personal property, your personality, your likeness, your information. And the threat, I think, that this could potentially pose from a moral standpoint is really terrifying. And the implications, online bullying. Could you imagine making an entire cartoon episode about someone you don't like and just making them look awful? The concept is great, but if you really expand it, blow it up, what could come out of it could also be really bad. So
I think one of the divergent things that I see with this type of technology from Black Mirror, though, is you said that when she got back to the office, everyone saw it.
Mm-hmm.
And if we're moving into a world, though, where every piece of content is actually custom tailored for each person, we may not have that water cooler of actually watching the same episodes or the same movies anymore, because the episode presented to you would be completely different than perhaps the episode presented to me. And so that is one of these things too, that we have to think of how that might change culturally and the dynamics of how we consume entertainment as well. So I completely agree that it could be a potential issue to be able to very quickly, dynamically create content that to use for malicious purposes. But we also need to ask ourselves, are we going to actually be watching the same stuff, which is going to be really different? And one of the things about the simulation that they talked about too is because these are virtual worlds and different things, you might have your own version. And they use like the Truman Show in one of the tweets, where you're watching your own virtual world of AIs where maybe you are represented or your favorite characters are represented or different things into that. But you'll be living in this virtual universe kind of independent from everybody else. And that is a really crazy thought and a little bit terrifying too, because so much of what you and I enjoy, like there we have certain shows or movies. We have on our Discord a little flicks for bros thing. We're talking about new stuff, and we can relate to that. We can talk about that. Certain memes and vernacular things come from those shows or those things, and those are all going to be different or divergent depending on who's consuming what. And maybe there'll be certain threads where you get 80 or 90% of the same content I do, and it's just tweaked ever so slightly. But I could also see a world where you're literally living in a complete media universe, independent from me, independent from your wife, independent from your neighbors or anyone else.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, we made the relation to kind of a super AI Sims game, and that sounds really cool. What's the other game? It's not. I mean, it's pretty popular. But Second Life, similar to that, right? You are in your own weird universe, and the implications are awesome. Sounds really fun. I would absolutely 100% try this out. That mixed with virtual reality and the technology leaps with that, man, we are headed to a Ready Player One scenario any day. I'm super excited for it. No, I'm just kidding.
Do you have your Apple headset all pre-ordered?
So dear God. Yeah, that thing's intense. Like, just like any other technology, man, when cars were invented, people had these same discussions. The possibilities are really cool, extremely helpful, can be awesome, but the negative implications are always going to be there too. It's this, I think, as the rate technology is churning out and adapting and growing so fast. I mean, within the last year, technology's exploded more so than it ever has in the past, let alone the last, 40, 50 years at that rate. You're never going to find a technology, especially now that we're this far along. It's really impressive. I strongly believe we're in an amazing stage of human development. A little scary, but an amazing stage. You're always going to be able to find pros and cons of everything, and there's never going to be a right answer, unfortunately.
So I'm an optimist when it comes to this kind of stuff. I was listening to Mark Andreessen, who was actually spoofed in one of the South Park episodes. So he's one of those he's a tech entrepreneur who created the original browser Mosaic and then Netscape Navigator, and now he's a really prolific venture fund person. So deep into the technology world, especially with AI. And he was talking about the possibilities and some of the disruptions with this stuff. And originally when we thought of automation and replacement back, especially 10 years ago, 20 years ago plus, we thought, okay, this is going to affect blue collar jobs. If you're a truck driver, well, that job's going to be gone. If you're in the service industry, or if you're a waiter, if you, fast food worker, all those jobs, checkout clerks at Walmart, unload trucks, all that kind of things. Well, those are going to be gone because robots are going to do these. And we're actually going into this new paradigm now where it's actually the white collar jobs that are doing it. And he said that most jobs, whether it be from generating legal drafts to doing medical diagnosis, a lot of consulting work, a lot of these arts and creative tasks can be done for anywhere between 1,000 to 10,000 times cheaper by AI. And so that's one of the things, and it gave one of the examples of this. They pulled up Midjourney and they created a 3D sculpture of this Nike shoe, and they were in our style of this artist, and they could do it in seconds. And you can So rather than hiring this specific person, they could generate that. So what would take the sculptor, or 3D modeler hours or days or weeks to create, they can do in seconds. To generate scripts or to review legal documents, all this stuff that maybe would take hundreds of dollars or thousands of dollars can now be done near instantaneously with this AI. Mm-hmm. And so we're moving into such a different world that we didn't foresee with this kind of stuff. And it really, again, let's kind of take that concept and why the writer strike is happening and the actor strike is happening, because those people have built their lives and their careers and the entertainment off of a lot of this work that they've generated. And if it all of a sudden becomes 1,000 times cheaper for somebody who just has access through their phone or on their laptop or whatever to use a service to get a similar or same result, especially with the cost of how movies are now, hundreds of millions, if not, what was it, Avatar, like $1 billion some dollars to create. If all that can be generated for pennies on the dollar equivalently, our whole world is going to change. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if it's necessarily like a horrific thing. It's just going to be a very different thing. And I think that, I don't know, it's just the rate in which this is happening is becoming so alarming. Yeah. And I do think that it's an important discussion to be had on things like intellectual property rights, things like copyrights, originality, what is transformative, what isn't transformative, and what is personal use. If this is an open source model that you can compile and run on your phone, and you want to make your own personal South Park episodes that you're never selling to anybody, but you're only consuming yourself, is that okay? Is that legal? And is that ethical? And so those are all kind of debates that are going to be had, right?
Yeah. And I think bare bones, what's going to come out of this advancement in technology and future ones that, will only come soon, is I think IP law is going to be bolstered. I think globally, definitely in the United States, it's already been referred to as nebulous and confusing and open to interpretation as IP law. But I think probably one of the benefits of technology moving at this rate is those laws concerning intellectual property are going to be nailed down very firmly. And they have to be. I mean, Tanner, you're an artist. Midjourney, I could go in and say, hey, here's Tanner's website, and I want you to make a picture of whatever in the style of Tanner. And then I can save that to my desktop and go somewhere and sell that picture. And I'm not an artist. I've never dealt with artistic IP issues, but I can only imagine that's hard to swallow for a lot of people. South Park creators. That's why I was really impressed and a little awestruck that they use South Park as an example, because that is a incredibly well-known intellectual property, right? But yeah, I don't know. I think the laws are going to get stricter. I think, and by stricter, I just mean nailed down.
Yeah. Well, we're going into such a unique time, because as it stands now, you can make for non-profit reasons, you can make certain types of work. So I can draw South Park characters and I can put them on my wall. And as long as I don't sell it, and I think that's why they can do this without any fear of legal repercussion, because they're not selling anything. It's an academic research concept. But if we fundamentally change how we consume, like if everyone becomes a creator in that sense, again, it's going to the current IP laws we have, because there will be no selling per se, there'll only be generating. And so it's a really unique thing where how will the laws need to be shaped to give individual creators who would sell their work or who created a lot of the stuff that things were trained on to be compensated accordingly. And we're seeing, even just to go back to the demands on the Screen Actors Guild and Writers Guild and what they're looking for, one of the big disruptors for them is they used to get a lot of residuals for things like syndication. When reruns happened, the writers would get a certain amount of money. But when streaming became so popular, then they wouldn't get the same amount of compensation for that, because like Netflix and all those companies are black boxes. They don't actually show how many downloads and different things happen. So that entire area of revenue just completely cut off due to a different type of technology that happened. And then now if we're going into AI with these generative things, that's going to, again, just completely change and remove all these different sources for creative outlets. So yeah, it's just a really interesting topic, and maybe we'll try to find some guests who are a little bit more in depth on that to where we can have a deeper discussion on it. But as it stands now, I'm just awestruck on how quickly these technologies are advancing. And again, I think that South Park episode, and we'll link some of the papers and the links in our show notes here, it's 80% there. There was actually a joke about they have it was like a pig telling jokes, and some of the jokes weren't that funny, and they were like supposed to be really offensive jokes, and they weren't offensive. And then they made some like Donald Trump vacuum cleaner joke, and I laughed out loud because they're like, because it was just like, oh, that joke's not offensive because it was about Donald Trump or something, and I just laughed because that would be such a South Park joke.
Very much so. And they capture their essence, and it's really cool. But as you said, like, every technology comes with a cultural paradigm shift. Streaming, that was a great example, Tanner. It changed how us lay people consume content. It changed how actors receive compensation. It's no different. So, that's a really good counter argument. But on the flip side, we were talking about if Universal Studios or whatever makes this amazing technology where they can just pump out content like that, that's great. If that technology is democratized. And what I mean by that is if the multi-billion-dollar production companies can create something off their computer in an hour, so should common creators or people who are curious. And I think that's been the saving grace of AI right now, is that most of the high-level AI tools, from ChatGPT to Midjourney to, the simulation and many others that are out there, they're democratized. And what I mean by that is anyone can access them. Don't get me wrong. Of course, corporations and I'm sure military are creating their own things that will be within their own, use cases. And that's fine. But for the most part, that's probably been the biggest saving grace, in my opinion, is AI was released to the world, not just to these people. And as long as they continue that path, Tanner, you and I we're content creators. We have a podcast. You're an artist. We make content. That's part of what we do. And I would be down there with the, strikers down in Hollywood if suddenly I couldn't create content anymore because one group or one type of person had, monopolized the technology. And that's not the case. And I think that's a good thing. And I hope that continues in the future.
Yeah. And that's, again, why it's so important right now as we fight these way through the court systems on this stuff, because in my opinion, if there becomes too much regulation on it, that's where you get the same issues with that you have in the banking industries and insurance industries and healthcare industries. It just becomes very industry captured. And so I agree. I'm very much a pro fan of a lot of these open source, very open projects. Stable Diffusion, one of the image generators, completely open source. Originally, OpenAI was supposed to be open source, and now they're closed, and they're becoming a little bit of the boogeyman, trying to go for regulation and industry capture there. But I agree. I think that my worry is that because of the power of a lot of these studios and things like that, it might close the door off of those things because it would be so disruptive to them. Again, if we're going back in that conversation of what is personal use and what can I generate for me, and if that becomes the standard rather than me going to Netflix and watching a show, I just end up creating my own personal shows. Well, there's no real money for studios, no money in streaming services for them to do that. So maybe I do worry where the control just happens with them, and then they end up just pumping out tons of custom content, but you have to pay every time for that. And they don't have to pay any of their back end really to do that. So they just reap that reward.
That's a fascinating concept. I didn't look at it that way. I guess I've been looking at this simulation differently, but you kind of made me think there. If there's a platform you could just make your own content, period. I mean, yeah, streaming services would go bananas and try and lock it down for themselves. And as you said, most of them are very rich and powerful, and they absolutely could. That'll be interesting to see as it goes forward in the future. But regardless, I have a very important for you question, Tanner. Question for you, as we near our time here. If you had access to a system like this, and it was robust, further down the development line it is today, you could put you, your family, and your friends into a virtual environment that already exists, like South Park or something like that. what universe would you choose to create content of you, your friends, and family first?
Well, definitely not Game of Thrones because it's too cutthroat.
Nope.
Right. I would do probably some like maybe the Disney universes or something like that. Just growing up in those type of worlds, I know there isn't like a specific Disney metaverse because they're all things, but just the idea of fairy tales and old storytelling and things like that would be really cool. I think you could get some, especially with the early ones where they were built off of really old stories with strong morals and strong storytelling aspects. It'd be really neat to actually put yourself into those, put your wife, your family, and see how those things would go through. And not make it the full Grimm fairy tales where they have bad endings, but the Disney ones where they all turn happily ever after. So I think that would be really fun content to know.
That's a good answer. Good answer. I think I would be somewhere in not Game of Thrones level, but I love fantasy. I've always loved knights and wizards and dragons, and I've always watched those movies. The old movie Willow, things like that. I think I would love to generate my own universe within some sort of fantasy content. Not Skyrim, because that's also just deadly, and if I'm going to put my family in there, I don't want to see them eaten by a dragon. But it's a great thought exercise. What is your favorite type of content? And if you could make that content just geared towards you specifically, it's really fascinating. I would love to see more.
And in a few months, we might have that. So
Right.
Who knows? Again, how fast all this AI stuff is going. But I don't know. There's, just to wrap up, there's a really important distinction with understanding of like what's possible and what's great and what these technology can enable us to do. But ultimately, how does that affect us all in terms of how we make livings and how we actually get the things that we love and value currently, and how will that disrupt and change those things? And there's a lot of just amazing people, again, creating those movies and creating those IPs, the artists, and doing that stuff. And if it disrupts it too quickly, how are they going to shift and adapt, and what are they going to do to, again, create original things? Because I don't know, my biggest concern, and we're starting to see this in Hollywood now, is there's no originality. It's the same Indiana Jones movie. There's the same, we're just replaying IPs from the 80s, whether that be Barbie or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
We're already kind of into that cycle of like no original things and no risk. So it's important to have a lot of those creative people still being able to produce content and have a marketplace to do so. And the tools can democratize that in certain ways, but they can also eliminate a lot of those options in other ways. So it's a really fine balancing act.
Double-edged sword. But for us lay people, it will be fascinating to see where it goes in the near future. Absolutely.
All right. Well, thanks for joining me, Wyatt, this week. I think that was a fun discussion. Again, we'll put all the links and stuff in the show notes, and really love to hear what your thoughts were. And in one of the comments, whether it be on the LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube, wherever, put what world you'd want to see yourself in. I think that would be fun to hear those stories.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, we'll see everybody next week. Bye-bye.